Behind the passionate tango, the vibrant soccer, and the breathtaking landscapes, there is an Argentina that few tourists know about. A country where the economy is on the brink of collapse, poverty is growing by leaps and bounds, and politics is like a minefield. One wrong choice and boom, everything blows up. While some toast with fine wine in Mendoza, others in Buenos Aires can barely put food on the table, living in slums where sewage runs in the open and violence dictates the rules. In some of these areas, the sound of gunfire is as common as the traffic in the center of the capital. Factions fight over territory, the police clash, and in the midst of it all, residents try to survive in an environment where the law is often imposed by fear. Today on Bello Mundo, we delve into the reality that travel guides don't show. Do you want to know how far this crisis goes? Then come with us. Number 1. Location and geographical data. Argentina has an impressive territorial extension, ranking second only to Brazil as the largest country in South America. In world terms, it ranks among the 10 largest on the planet. The geography is extremely diverse. In the north, in regions like Salta and Jujuy, you'll find colorful mountains and a drier climate. Meanwhile, in the south, you'll find the famous and icy Patagonia, full of monumental glaciers, cold deserts, and fjords that could easily have come out of a fantasy movie set. Not to mention Tierra del Fuego, where the country shares a maritime border with Chile and is close to the icy waters of Antarctica. The central region of Argentina, known as the Pampa, is where the large cattle and grain farms are concentrated. This is where much of Argentina's reputation for unparalleled meat comes from, responsible for so many delicious barbecues or roasts. And of course, you can't forget cosmopolitan Buenos Aires, a metropolis on the banks of the River Plate, where modern skyscrapers, wide avenues, and historic neighborhoods inspire any architecture lover. It's a place that seems to have it all: a varied climate, exuberant scenery, and great agricultural potential. However, as is the case in many countries, geographical grandeur does not necessarily reflect the social well-being of a population that for the most part faces abandonment and extreme poverty. Number 2. History. Argentine history is full of ups and downs, and it's no exaggeration to say that there have been times when the country was among the global powers. It all began in the colonial period, when the region became a strategic point for the Spanish Empire. In the 19th century, the struggle for independence was marked by intense battles and historical figures such as José de San Martín, who helped consolidate the country's sovereignty. With freedom won, Argentina entered an era of accelerated growth. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the country experienced its economic peak. Agricultural production exploded, meat and grain exports transformed Buenos Aires into one of the main financial centers of the time, and the city earned the nickname of the Paris of South America for its elegant architecture and European style. But like everything that rises quickly, the fall was also strong. The 20th century brought a sequence of political and economic crises, as well as alternating between democratic governments and military dictatorships. The darkest period came between 1976 and 1983, when the dictatorship persecuted opponents, imprisoned, tortured, and disappeared thousands of people. A trauma that still echoes in Argentine society. With the return of democracy in the 80s, it seemed that a new beginning was coming, but the economy remained a chronic problem. The financial collapse of 2001 was one of the worst moments in the country's history, driving millions into poverty and sparking massive protests. Since then, the country has been fighting a constant battle against inflation, inequality, and political turmoil, And while at times the economy seems to react, the truth is that these breaths of relief almost always give way to new storms. Number 3. Inflation and the economic crisis. If there's one problem that never leaves Argentina, it's inflation. Decade after decade, the country finds itself trapped in a vicious cycle that has brought down governments, broken companies, and destroyed the population's purchasing power. It's so chronic that, in recent years, inflation has rarely fallen below 100% a year. In 2023, for example, the index closed at 211%. In 2024, there was a slowdown, closing the year at 117%, which is still an absurd figure for any economy. And, as always, it's the people who suffer most. Salaries become practically worthless overnight, prices change several times in the same week, and the cost of living becomes a nightmare. Saving money in pesos? Unthinkable. Buying food at the market? A daily challenge. Planning anything long-term? Not a chance. The government, whatever it is, always tries to remedy the chaos with emergency measures, price freezes, economic packages, and even agreements with the IMF. But at the end of the day, the inflation time bomb is still alive, ready to explode at any moment. The country is currently undergoing a major economic restructuring with the so-called chainsaw plan. The proposal includes drastic cuts in public spending, deregulation of the economy, and an attempt to reduce state interference. However, while the measures are being implemented, the peso continues to melt and uncertainty grows. The result? A population that has become accustomed to living on a tightrope, traders who don't know how much to charge for their stock, and investors running to safer currencies. Number 4. Poverty and inequality. It's no exaggeration to say that Argentina today lives with poverty rates that border on the absurd for a country that was once so rich. Today, more than half the population is below the poverty line, and the situation is even more critical among children. Entire families make do as best they can, many depending on community kitchens to guarantee at least one meal a day. And even with social assistance programs, the demand is far greater than the government's capacity to meet everyone's needs. On the streets of Buenos Aires, the contrast between wealth and poverty does not go unnoticed. On the one hand, neighborhoods like Recoleta and Palermo remain showcases for high society. On the other, there are the so-called villas of misery, which we'll talk about later. But the inequality doesn't stop in the capital. In provinces like Chaco, Formosa, and Santiago del Estero, the situation is even worse. These regions deal with problems that go beyond a lack of money. There are towns without paved roads, scrapped hospitals, and schools that can barely function. For many, it's as if Argentina had been divided into two worlds, one that continues to advance, and another that seems to have been forgotten in time. Number 5. The slums, villas. If you walk around Buenos Aires, you'll see charming cafes, well-kept squares, and avenues reminiscent of European capitals. But you only have to go off the beaten track to find another side of the city. The villas, miseria, the Argentine slums. These neighborhoods began to appear decades ago when families from the interior moved to the capital in search of opportunities. But with no money to pay expensive rents, they ended up occupying irregular plots of land and building makeshift homes. At first, they were small settlements. Today, these areas have become gigantic communities with narrow alleyways, their own shops, and a constant flow of new residents. And the problem is only growing. With inflation soaring and unemployment skyrocketing, more and more people have been pushed into these places in recent years. For many, it's not a choice. It's the only alternative to not sleeping on the street. But living there means facing a harsh reality. The infrastructure is precarious, basic sanitation is almost non-existent, and crime is rife. It's not uncommon to see sewage running in the open, dirt roads that turn to mud when it rains, and houses without regular access to drinking water. One of the most famous is the Padre Ricciardelli community in the Flores neighborhood, better known as Villa 11114, one of the most dangerous places in Buenos Aires. There, drug trafficking factions dominate the streets, and violence is part of everyday life. Shootings, clashes with the police, and disputes between gangs are part of the routine, while the rest of the city carries on as if this reality simply didn't exist. According to data published on the Swissinfo news platform, the population living in villas has grown in recent years, a direct result of the economic crisis. With no money to pay rent and no real housing plan, thousands of people end up trapped in this cycle. The problem? Getting out is not so simple. Without government support, with scarce opportunities and an unstable economy, the villa becomes a prison without bars. Number 6. Pensioners and the elderly at risk. In the midst of so much economic instability, one group that suffers particularly cruelly is pensioners. After decades of work, the expectation of a peaceful old age gives way to a distressing reality. Pensions eroded by inflation, difficulty in accessing basic services, and, in many cases, a daily struggle to simply survive. With the cost of living skyrocketing, many elderly people are forced to continue working. In low-income neighborhoods, it's not uncommon to find men and women in their 70s doing odd jobs to supplement their income, whether selling sweets on the street, collecting recyclables, or even taking on exhausting tasks that should be far from their concerns at this stage of life. And when it comes to health, the situation only gets worse. According to Human Rights Watch, HRW, access to quality medical services is a serious problem for Argentina's elderly. In Buenos Aires, there is still some structure, but in the countryside, the reality is different. A lack of specialists, outdated equipment, and hospitals that can't keep up with demand. For those who need continuous medication, the bill doesn't add up. Often the choice is between eating or buying essential medicines. The social protection network, as much as it exists, can't keep up with galloping inflation. Every time pensions are adjusted, prices have jumped again, making any correction ineffective. The result? Elderly people who, after a lifetime of work, end up depending on NGOs, family members, or, in extreme cases, end up on the streets. For a country that was once a benchmark for quality of life, seeing the elderly treated in this way is one of the cruelest portraits of the crisis. Number 7. Financial scams and Ponzi-demia. When money loses value every day, despair takes over. Salaries that evaporate before the end of the month, savings that yield nothing, and a financial system that has already broken down several times. In this chaotic scenario, it's no surprise that many people end up looking for alternatives, and that's where the scammers come in. In recent years, Argentina has been gripped by a wave of fraudulent financial schemes, dubbed the Ponzi-demia by the local media, a veritable epidemic of financial pyramids. Promises of absurd profits, daily returns in dollars or cryptocurrencies, and guarantees of easy money. Sound too good to be true? It is. The scam follows a classic script. Someone you trust presents you with an unmissable opportunity. The initial investment is low, the returns are quick and guaranteed, and the more people you bring in, the bigger your profit will be. At first, everything seems perfect. The first investors actually receive money, creating the illusion of a legitimate business. But deep down, there is no such thing. The money that comes in is just redistributed among the participants without any real investment behind it. The problem? Like any house of cards, one day it collapses. When new investors stop coming in, the flow of money dries up. Those responsible disappear, and whoever was last in the scheme loses everything. And these are not isolated cases. Entire towns have been impacted by scams of this kind. In San Pedro, for example, around 30% of the population fell for a single scam. People sold houses, took out loans, and put all their savings into the promise of a better life. And in the end, they were left with nothing. The worst thing is that, in the midst of the economic chaos, many victims don't even manage to report it, either out of shame or a lack of trust in justice. Meanwhile, new scams emerge, often in new guises and with new promises, but always exploiting the same desperation. After all, how can you compete with inflation and financial insecurity without falling into traps? For many Argentinians, this is still an unanswered question. Number 8. Corruption. And as if all that wasn't enough, if there's one thing that never goes out of fashion in Argentine politics, it's corruption. You can change the government, change the ministers, turn the economy upside down, but the scandals always find a way to surface. Over the years, Argentina has collected episodes of bribery in public works, embezzlement schemes, and suspicious enrichment. Ministers have fallen, governors have been implicated, and even presidents have had to face heavy accusations. The feeling among Argentinians is almost always the same. Politicians are more concerned with their own pockets than with the future of the country. Several Argentine and international newspapers have already published several reports, pointing out how institutional corruption and a lack of transparency are factors aggravating the economic crisis. And if there's one thing that Argentina's history has taught us, it's that it doesn't matter who's in charge, scandals will appear. The current president took office promising to end corruption and dismantle the rotten system. But just a few months later, accusations began to surface that put his words to the test. The first scandal involved two close allies of the government, Juan Paso, head of the Revenue and Customs Control Agency, ARCA, and his deputy, Andrés Vázquez. Both were investigated for omitting millionaire assets abroad, including companies registered in tax havens. Spain's El País newspaper revealed details of suspicious financial transactions, which, curiously, did not appear in official declarations. In other words, trusted government figures were involved in the same kind of scam that the president swore to eradicate. But it didn't stop there. Another controversial case came from the Rio Turbio coal deposits, where foreign companies reported that bribes were being demanded to facilitate contracts. If confirmed, the accusations could indicate that old practices are still going strong in the new government. Then came the icing on the cake, the central bank's gold bars. In August 2024, Argentina was taken by surprise by the news that gold ingots worth $1.5 billion had been moved or even withdrawn from the national reserves without any transparency. The Swiss newspaper Huffington Post reported that Argentine parliamentarians had demanded explanations about the whereabouts of the gold, accusing the government of concealment. The official response: secrecy for security reasons. The problem is that this justification didn't convince many people. At the end of the day, a government that arrived promising to sweep corruption under the carpet is already collecting suspicions. The investigations are still underway, and it may be that some accusations will fall apart, but the damage to credibility has already been done. And so the question remains: will Argentina ever be able to break free of this vicious cycle, or will corruption continue to be a fixture in the country's politics? If you've made it this far, you've already realized that Argentina goes far beyond tango and breathtaking landscapes. Now I want to know, which of these realities shocked you the most? Leave a comment and share this video so that more people can get to know this other side of the country. And of course, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications to follow our next discoveries in our Bello Mundo. Thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.